I was 9 years old the first time my sister told a room full of people something about me that wasn't true, and everyone believed her. We were at my grandmother's house in Barrie for Thanksgiving, that kind of Ontario autumn weekend, where the whole family crowds into a too-small kitchen. Someone always ends up crying before the pie is served. My sister was 12. She told my aunts and my grandmother that I had broken the ceramic rooster that sat on the windowsill above the sink, the one my grandmother had brought back from a trip to Portugal years before I was. I hadn't touched it. I had watched it fall when my sister bumped the counter reaching for a glass. She looked right at me when she said my name, and I saw something in her face that I didn't have a word for at 9 years old. I know the word now. It was satisfaction. My grandmother wasn't angry. She just looked at me with this particular kind of tiredness and said, "You need to be more careful," and that was that. My sister set the table, and I spent the rest of the afternoon convinced there was something fundamentally wrong with the air around me, something that made the truth slide off me before it could land. I spent the next 20 years watching that same expression cross my sister's face in different rooms, at different ages, over different things. A scratch on the car that wasn't mine. A rumor at school she started, and let circle back to me. The time she told our parents I had skipped 2 weeks of classes in my second year of university, when I had, in fact, been dealing with a monodiagnosis I hadn't told anyone about because I didn't want to worry them. She got that wrong on purpose or by accident. I still don't know which is worse. Her name is Fiona. She's 3 years older than me, and she has always been the kind of person who fills a room in a way I never could. Not because she's louder, exactly, though she is that. It's more that she seems to understand intuitively what a room wants from her, and she gives it, and then she uses the credit she's built up to say things that no one questions because she's already established herself as the reasonable one, the one who tells the truth. I am 31 years old. I am a physiotherapist. I work at a sports medicine clinic in Ottawa, and I have built, slowly and carefully, a life that feels like mine in a way that nothing in my childhood ever quite did. I have an apartment with south-facing windows. I have a cat named after a Joni Mitchell album that everyone thinks is named after Joni Mitchell herself, and I don't correct them. I have a partner named Theo, not Theo from the name list, a different Theo, my Theo. And I say that knowing it sounds small, but after years of having the things I said about myself corrected and reframed and quietly dismantled, calling something mine without bracing for the counter-argument still feels radical. Theo Beaumont is 34, a structural engineer who grew up in Sudbury and moved to Ottawa for a contract job 7 years ago, and never left. We met at a mutual friend's housewarming party in Centertown. He was standing in the kitchen, holding a bottle of Sleeman's and reading the ingredients label with genuine concentration. And when I asked him about it, he said he was trying to figure out if he could replicate it, and we talked about fermentation chemistry for 40 minutes before either of us introduced ourselves. By the end of the night, we had exchanged numbers, and I had this particular feeling I hadn't had in a long time, like I'd been in a conversation where the other person actually wanted to know what I thought, not just what I'd say next. We dated for 2 years before he proposed on a Tuesday in February, in my apartment, with the heat not quite working, and both of us wrapped in a blanket on the couch, watching something neither of us was really watching. He said my name and I looked over, and he had this small velvet box he'd been holding in his jacket pocket, and when I asked him how long it had been in there, he said 3 weeks. 3 weeks of waiting for the right moment before he finally decided there wasn't going to be a right moment, just a Tuesday. We planned the wedding for a Saturday in late October. Niagara-on-the-Lake, a small inn with a vineyard, 40 guests, the kind of wedding that took 6 months to organize and looked effortless on the day. We booked the rehearsal dinner for the Friday evening at a restaurant called the Parlor Room on Queen Street, a restored Victorian space with dark wood and warm light, and the kind of atmosphere that makes everyone look like they're in a painting. My sister had been part of the wedding party since the beginning. I'd asked her because she's my sister, and because some part of me, the part that has never fully updated its operating system, believed that if I just kept trying, kept including her, kept showing up with good faith, she would eventually meet me there. I know how that sounds, I know it, and I still did it because she is my sister, and because the alternative was grief that I was not ready to sit with. What happened 22 days before my wedding was not something I saw coming, which I understand is its own kind of sentence. I should have seen it coming. I know that now. But I didn't, because knowing someone is capable of something and believing they will actually do it are two different things. And I am still, apparently, someone who splits that difference in the wrong direction. Theo called me on a Wednesday afternoon while I was between patients at the clinic. His voice was careful. Not upset, not cold. Careful, the way you are with something you need to handle without breaking it further. He told me that my sister had come to his office, without telling me. She'd shown up at the engineering firm where he works in Canada, asked the front desk for him, and when she was brought to a meeting room, she sat down across from him and told him that I had been fired from my previous physiotherapy position for falsifying patient records. I sat in the small staff room at the clinic with the door closed and the noise of the waiting room muffled through the wall, and I felt something that I don't have a clean word for. Not shock, because shock implies the information was surprising its own. It was more like watching a lock click open on something you'd spent years believing was sealed. It wasn't true. It had never been true. But it was built around something real, the way the best lies always are, and I knew the moment Theo told me that my sister had calculated exactly which thread to pull. 3 years ago, I worked at a rehabilitation clinic in Nepean. I had a patient, I won't use details that could identify anyone, who was a competitive athlete recovering from a knee reconstruction. Treatment was going well, ahead of schedule, and I was genuinely proud of the work we were doing together. His recovery plan was updated frequently as his progress changed, which is completely standard in physiotherapy. But a colleague who had issues with me going back to an incident during a team meeting and filed an internal complaint suggesting the frequency of updates indicated improper record keeping. The complaint was reviewed. I was cleared entirely. Not disciplined, not cautioned. Cleared, because there was nothing to find. I left that clinic 8 months later, not because of the complaint, but because a position opened at my current clinic, and it was a better fit. My sister knew about the complaint. I had told her about it when it happened because I was stressed, and she was my sister, and I thought, the way I apparently keep thinking, that she was someone I could tell things to. She had been sympathetic at the time. She had said the right things, and she had filed it away, apparently, like something she might need later, and 3 years later she walked into my fiancé's office and handed him a version of the story that stopped before the part where I was cleared. She told him I had falsified records. She told him the clinic had quietly let me go to avoid a formal complaint being filed with the College of Physiotherapists of Ontario. She told him that my current employer didn't know, that I had given them a reference who covered for me, and that he deserved to know the kind of person he was marrying before it was too late to make a different choice. Theo, because he is Theo, did not believe her outright. He also did not dismiss her entirely, because he is not the kind of person who closes his eyes to difficult information, and because the story she told was specific enough and calm enough that it had texture. He came to me and he asked me quietly if there was something about that job that I needed to tell him. I drove to his apartment that night and I told him everything. The complaint, the timeline, the colleague, the review, the outcome. I showed him the letter I had received from the clinic's administration confirming the complaint had been resolved and no action taken. I showed him my letter of reference from that clinic's director, written 8 months after the complaint, which is not something you receive if you were quietly pushed out for falsifying records. He read everything. He asked a few questions. He held my hand across the table and said, "I believe you. I'm sorry she put you through this." But the damage was already there. I could feel it, not in how Theo looked at me. He was steady, he remained steady, but in the space the accusation now occupied. My sister hadn't needed Theo to believe her completely. She'd only needed to plant a question close enough to our wedding that it would sit in the room with us. She understood from 22 years of practice exactly how much weight a specific, calm, well-timed lie can carry. What she hadn't accounted for was a woman named Bex Holloway. Bex had been my closest colleague at the Nepean Clinic, the one person there who had been unambiguously in my corner during the complaint process. She'd been a witness during the internal review. She'd watched the whole thing unfold from inside, and she knew every detail with a clarity that no one outside the clinic could replicate. We had stayed in loose contact after I left. Christmas messages, the occasional coffee when our schedules aligned, and she still worked at the clinic, now as a senior clinician. I hadn't told her what my sister had done. I hadn't told anyone except Theo. But 4 days before the rehearsal dinner, I received a text from Bex asking if I was okay. And when I asked what she meant, she said that someone had called the clinic asking about me. The receptionist had mentioned it to her because the caller had asked specifically whether I had left under any kind of formal or informal disciplinary process. The receptionist had said she couldn't speak to former employees' records, which is the correct and legal answer. But Bex had recognized the description of the caller. A woman, the voice, the line of questioning, and she had a feeling. I called Bex that evening. I told her what had happened. She was quiet for a long moment, and then she said, "I'll be there Friday." I hadn't asked her to come. I hadn't thought to. She said she wanted to, that she wasn't going to let 22 days of poison sit in the room at my rehearsal dinner without an antidote nearby. And I cried in a way I hadn't let myself cry since Theo had called me, the kind of crying that comes from realizing you are not, in fact, alone in a room where someone is rewriting you. The rehearsal dinner was on a Friday in October, the kind of Ontario fall night where the air smells like wood smoke, and the sky goes dark early, and the cold is just enough to make the light inside look warmer than it is. The parlor room had been transformed in the way that good restaurants know how to transform themselves. The usual dinner crowd replaced by our people. Long tables pushed together, autumn arrangements of dried wheat and orange dahlias, and the deep burgundy of fall roses. The whole room smelled like cedar and candle wax, and faintly, the good wine that Theo's best friend had insisted on pairing with everything. Theo was near the window with his brother and his father, laughing at something. He had his jacket on and his collar open, and he looked like himself, which sounds like nothing but is everything when you know what it cost him to remain himself over the previous 3 weeks. He saw me come in, and his face did what it always does, this particular settling, like something in him relaxes when I walk into the room. I held on to that. My sister was already seated. She was wearing a dark green dress and she had her hair down, and she looked like what she always looks like at family events. Put together, relaxed, the kind of woman other people's mothers compliment. She had a glass of and she was talking to my aunt, and when she saw me she smiled, and I thought, briefly and absurdly, about the rooster on my grandmother's windowsill. I had not uninvited her. I want to explain that, because I know it's the thing that doesn't make sense from the outside, and I know it would have been the comment that got the most likes if any of this had been posted online. Why was she there? Why, after what she had done, had I let her come? The honest answer is that I had spent 3 weeks in a state of profound exhaustion, the kind that comes not from lack of sleep, but from having to hold too much at once: the wedding logistics, Theo's steadiness, which required my steadiness in return, the knowledge of what my sister had done without yet having the tools to do anything about it. Uninviting her would have required a conversation I didn't have the capacity for. I had told myself she would sit quietly and let the evening pass. I had told myself that sometimes the right move is to wait. I know. Bex arrived at 7:40. I saw her before she saw me. She was standing in the entrance to the dining room in a charcoal blazer with a leather satchel over one shoulder, and she had the look of someone who has driven 3 hours with a purpose and is not uncertain about it. She had driven from Ottawa to Niagara-on-the-Lake on a Friday afternoon in October, which anyone who knows the 401 through Hamilton will understand is not a casual commitment. She scanned the room, found me, and crossed to me directly. She didn't stop to admire the flowers or make eye contact with anyone else. She said my name once, quietly, and then she said, "I need to show you something before this goes any further." I took her into the hallway outside the dining room, a narrow corridor with dark wallpaper and a coat rack and the muffled sound of conversation behind the closed door. She opened the satchel and took out a folder. Inside were documents. A copy of the internal review outcome from the Nepean Clinic, official letterhead, dated, signed by the clinic director and the HR manager, confirming the complaint had been reviewed and closed with no findings against me. My letter of reference from the same director, which Bex had obtained as a copy through a formal request she had made, as part of the clinic's internal record audit process. She was a senior clinician now and had access to certain administrative records in ways I hadn't known to use. And beneath those, a printed screenshot of a voicemail transcript from the clinic's general inbox, left 3 weeks ago, from a caller who had identified herself as a family member of a former employee and asked whether disciplinary action had been taken in a specific time period. The caller had not identified herself by name, but the number attached to the voicemail was visible in the transcript. It was my sister's number. Bex had gone to the clinic's administration herself, explained the situation, and obtained documentation of the inquiry. The administrator had found the voicemail troubling enough that they had formally documented it. It sat in the folder like a fact that had always been waiting to be this clear. I stood in that hallway for a long time with the folder in my hands. The carpet was a deep burgundy, and the wallpaper had this pattern of faded botanical illustrations, and I remember noticing both of those things in a way that felt very specific, the way you notice small details when something large is happening in your chest. What I felt was not rage. What I felt was something I can only describe as the end of a particular kind of hope. Not hope for anything good, but hope that I was wrong, that I had misread her, that there was some version of my sister I had missed who was not capable of this. There wasn't. This was who she was. She had been this person at 12 with a ceramic rooster, and she was this person at 34 with a voicemail and a visit to my fiancé's office, and the only thing that had changed was the stakes. I went back into the dining room. Theo read my face the way he always does, without making me perform composure I didn't have, and he came to stand beside me. I felt his hand at the small of my back, and I took one breath, and then I walked to the table where my sister was sitting. The table went quiet in the way that rooms go quiet when something shifts in the atmosphere before anyone has said anything yet. I placed the folder on the table in front of her. I did not raise my voice. I have spent too many years being dismissed for being emotional to make that mistake in a room full of people who mattered to me. I told the room what was in the folder. Not all of it, not every detail, but enough. That my sister had gone to my fiancé's workplace 22 days before our wedding and told him I had been fired for falsifying patient records, that this was not true. That I had been cleared of an internal complaint 3 years ago, completely informally, and that the documentation in that folder confirmed it. That she had then called my former clinic trying to obtain further damaging information, and that call was also documented. My sister looked at the tablecloth. She did not speak. She did not look at Theo. She did not look at me. My mother, sitting 2 seats down, said Fiona very quietly, and there was something in the way she said it. Not surprise, I noticed, not disbelief, but something more like exhaustion, that told me this was not, to her, entirely outside the realm of what she might have expected. I asked my sister to leave. She picked up her clutch and she left. She didn't speak, she didn't look back. The room was silent. It was the kind of silence that asks you to hold it for a moment before anything breaks it, and I stood there holding it, and then Theo's mother, a woman named Vera who has been kind to me since the first Sunday dinner I attended at their house in Sudbury, who makes tourtière from scratch every December and once drove 4 hours to help us move a couch, stood up at the far end of the table and started to applaud. It was slow at first. And then the whole table joined, and I stood there in the warm light of the parlor room, with Theo's hand in mine, and Bex across the room watching me with wet eyes, and something that might have been, for the first time in a long time, something very close to peace. We were married the following Saturday. The vineyard was gold and rust, and that particular shade of October red that you only get in Ontario when season is at its peak, and everything is beautiful and slightly dying, and it was perfect in a way I hadn't let myself believe it would be. 40 people, the ones we loved most, the ones who knew us and not just a version of us. Theo cried during his vows, the kind of crying he tried to hold back and then gave up on, and I waited until he finished before I cried through mine, which was the deal we had made, both of us failing at it in the best way. Beck sat in the second row and handed me a tissue at exactly the right moment. My sister was not there. Neither were a handful of other relatives who in the weeks following the rehearsal dinner made it clear through their silence which version of events they preferred to believe. That silence told me everything I needed to know about why I had spent 31 years feeling like a liar in rooms where I wasn't lying. I am a physiotherapist. I work with people who are rebuilding the function of something that was damaged. A joint, a muscle, a pathway between intention and movement. The work is slow and specific, and there are no shortcuts. You cannot skip the inflammation stage. You have to let the tissue do what tissue does, and you have to be there for it, consistently, without rushing the timeline. I think about that a lot now, when I think about the version of me who spent 3 decades trying to outrun a story my sister kept telling about who I was. Healing is not dramatic. It doesn't happen in a room full of applause, though the room full of applause was something I will carry for the rest of my life. It happens in the Tuesday mornings after, when you reach for your coffee and realize you didn't spend the first 10 minutes of the day bracing for something. It happens when someone tells you something untrue about yourself, and you feel the ground hold under you instead of shifting. Theo and I bought a house in the Glebe last spring. A 1940s semi-detached, with a narrow backyard and original hardwood, and a kitchen that needs work that we keep not quite getting around to. We have a life that is ours, built from the ground up, no one's revision of it but our own. My sister and I don't speak. That isn't the tragedy my extended family seems to think it is. It is, if I'm honest, one of the quietest and most solid decisions I have ever made. The kind that doesn't need defending because it simply is, and it holds. If something in this story landed somewhere familiar, if you have ever sat in a room where someone calmly, confidently told people something false about you, and the truth just slid off the walls, I want you to know that the documentation exists. The folder can be assembled. And the people who drove 3 hours on a Friday afternoon in October to hand it to you are worth every bit of the life you're building. If this story reached you, please consider subscribing. Every story on this channel is for someone who needed to hear it today. Hit subscribe, turn on notifications, and come back for the next one. Because the chapter after the rehearsal dinner is always the one worth reading.